Well, hello and greeting, folks. I welcome you to this next conversation on racial reconciliation. Pastor Brian here, and I have Dr. Andre and Petrina Branch with us again. And we've taken a few weeks off. Life has just been busy and getting the kids back to school and certain things going again. And so we're thankful to have this opportunity to come back and have another conversation. And as you all know, these conversations have been important, and it is important to continue having these conversations. So Andre and Petrina, thank you so much for taking more of your time, spending another Saturday mid-morning with me. I appreciate it. And we've done a lot of introduction through these different conversations. So rather than more introduction, I would suggest, if it's okay with you both, that we just jump in. We've sort of got three subjects that we had roughly agreed on. I'm going to sort of pose a thought, a question, and we'll just go from there. Is that okay?
Yes.
That's good.
All right. Okay. So let's start in the I was going to say the political realm, which may be the most dangerous place to start, but let's start there. So I don't know, there's something like 20 plus days until the election. The campaigning has already been feverish. I suspect it will only get more so, and race has become a central issue in the presidential election. For example, there's been obvious race-related issues such as failing to condemn white supremacy in the last debate. But there's also been other covert, I would say, less obvious actions, such as the statement, your suburbs will no longer be safe. And then there's this whole issue of rioting and looting and violence on both sides after the protests. So I don't know where the question is in all that. How have you all experienced all of this? And how can you help us understand where issues of race have been used and have entered into American politics this year?
Well, I think that statement about your suburbs will no longer be safe is just one example of the many racist things that our president has said over the years. And he's appealing to a base that includes people who are white nationalists, a base that includes people who are white supremacists. He started out his sort of political career with this birtherism movement, challenging the legitimacy of President Barack Obama. He started his campaign with statements about people from Mexico who are coming to the United States as being rapists. He's called people, African countries, S-hole countries. He's told Black Congresswomen to go back where they came from. They're US citizens. So, these are just, and as you mentioned, he has failed to condemn white nationalists, white supremacists, and actually in the last debate seemed to show support with his comment about, Proud Boys that stand back and stand by. So it's just a pattern of racist, both speech and actions that this president has used to divide the country. And he thinks under some theory that, this will help him get elected. This will rile up his base. It's deplorable. And, as it appears that, he has a possibility of not winning, he's going to be more desperate in trying to get everybody who he thinks is in his base to show up.
I think Mr. Trump has made racism fashionable again. He has given racists in the country permission to flaunt their racism out loud. it is clear that he is a racist. He supports white supremacy. I mean, there is just no denying that at this point, hearing his rhetoric. And I think it's rather dangerous to say these things, to believe these things, to radicalize people, telling them to stand back and stand by, encouraging them to go to polling places. I hope I'm wrong, but I anticipate that there will be violence at the polling places as a result of these people being there, intimidating folks who are simply trying to cast their ballots. And it will be regrettable. But Mr. Trump has initiated these things. He has stirred up these people. And it's really sad to see how racism is thoroughly ensconced in this country, in the hearts and minds of people in this country. Even if Mr. Trump loses this election, we have to reckon with the reality that we will be in a country of 330 million people that includes a great number of racist people who support white supremacy. And I think it is most sad that many of these people who support Mr. Trump call themselves Christian conservatives. It is a very sad place to be in the United States of America at this point.
Yeah, he's never acted like the president for all of us. You know, we've had thousands of people take to the streets this year to protest, you know, systemic racism, police brutality, and for equal opportunity. But despite that, he's never even said anything to suggest that he understands, cares, or wants to make any of those changes, that he sees those people, that he hears those issues, and that he cares about at all doing anything about them. He appeals to a very slim, I hope, part of our community or our country, and people of color are really just not part of the group of people that he wants to you know, represent or help or even show any sense of desire to address any of the issues of concern.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Dr. Branch, you mentioned the church and Christianity. I was in a conversation with some colleagues a couple of days ago, and we were talking about sort of what is the message that we give to our congregations after the election, depending on what happens, and the need to do some reconciliation within the church, because clearly the church, and I'm not just talking about our church here in Chula Vista, but the church is divided. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was thinking about is, yeah, there's some reconciliation that's needed within the church to bring different factions of the church together. But there's some people out there that are claiming to be the church that I would say we don't really need to do reconciliation with them, because that's not even the movement of Christ that they're a part of. They may be calling themselves the church, but that's not Christianity, or certainly not a Christianity that I recognize, or that I would argue is recognized from the biblical witness. So it's been sad to see that. It's been sad for me to see just the number of people who have been emboldened in such a way that I sort of felt like maybe 10 years ago, if people felt certain ways, they may not say it or act on it. But now it's like, it's normalized, like to say those racist things or to act on those racist things is like, sure, we can do that.
So
And that's been sad to see for me, the sheer number of people that have followed this part of the movement.
And I think about the folks who believe that this has somehow just happened, that the United States has somehow just become so racist, so white supremacist, and that is so far from the truth. Mr. Trump and people who support him have just made being racist more comfortable. They've made these people feel like they can say these things with impunity, and they do.
Right, right.
It hasn't just happened. People in the civil rights activists movement have been saying for years the country needs to address systemic racism and inequality. And we haven't done it. That is, the country hasn't done it. And we see now the result of not addressing this as a nation. Mm-hmm. We see these sleeper cells, if you will, coming alive and running rampant throughout our country, throughout every institution of our country.
Yes. Yeah, the other group of people that has been disheartening to me is I hear from folks out there that say, you know, they might say something like, well, I like President, you know, I like President Trump, or even the politics of that side for the, you know, economic policy or whatever. And then if you say, yeah, but what about the sort of racist tendencies? And they'll say, well, I don't really like that, but I'm still going to vote this way because of these other policies that I do agree with. But to put a group of people in power that have such racist tendencies, even if you like other policies that they have, just does not sit with me.
My question is, what are these other policies that they like?
Right.
I mean, I would argue that some of the other policies are racist at their core as well. Mm-hmm. For example, it has been my contention for a number of years, people who support Trump and others like him want to see arch conservative judges in the judicial system. And they want those judges there so that they can put behind bars more Black people, other people of color, and keep the so-called suburbs safe for white folks. That is racist at its core. Mm-hmm. So if you say, well, we tolerate Mr. Trump because we want to see more conservative judges, for what end?
Yes.
Major initiatives have been judges, immigration, and that has been a policy of inflicting massive pain and on people of color trying to seek refugee status. So if that's what one of those other policy is, that's a racist policy.
Against human beings.
I mean, how do you separate children from their parents and call yourself a Christian at the same time? if you're supporting that policy, that's what you're supporting.
And how do you call yourself pro-life and take such horrible actions against life, against humanity? What it means is these people don't see some human beings as actual human beings. You strip them of their humanity, and then you can do whatever you like to them.
Yes, yes.
And
So,
I was just say the other major initiative has been tax reform, they call it, but that big tax law benefited the wealthiest people of the country. So how does that help, you know, regular, ordinary citizens? It's helping the wealthiest. So I don't still say, what policy is it that you know, that they like, you know?
Right. Well, and I would suggest in most of those cases, it's policy that benefits them. And so they don't necessarily see it as a race issue, but I think the question stands: what policy out there do they like that is not benefiting or in detriment to a certain race of people or people of color? So I want to talk about one of those policies now, and let me just say, I know I began this conversation by talking about politics and bringing up politics, and I don't want these conversations to be overtly political, because it needs to go beyond our politics. But I do think that when race is inserted into the conversation by the politicians, then we need to talk about it. And even in the church, that we can't refrain from talking about that. Now, so the next conversation, I really want to talk about education. And there's been a number of conversations in the last few weeks that have to do with the education, how we do education around race and equality in the government and private business, also how we do that in the schools. I don't think this is necessarily has to be a political conversation. I think it really needs to be a conversation about how we help our country understand race relations and move to the next place we need to be. And so this idea that we need to have pro-American curriculum in schools, and these ideas that we need to eliminate diversity training in the workplace or in the government. You know, how do you see, I mean, if we were to do those two things, to have pro-American curriculum and eliminate diversity training, how does that affect race relations going forward?
We have had this shift towards what's called a Trump is now called this a pro-American curriculum, but for a number of years, we have had state boards of education and more local boards of education reject curricula that includes people of color and the perspectives of people of color for a number of years. And this was the objective. Oh my, I've forgotten his name. But this has been the objective for some time. And we talked about this some time ago when we discussed curriculum and the rejection of the history standards in this country. And we had Bill Bennett, Diane Ravitch from Columbia, uh, uh, Bob Dole's wife, Elizabeth Dole, when Bob Dole was the speaker, these people collectively rejected the history standards that had gone to the Senate, and the Senate voted them down because they said the curriculum was too much in favor of people of color, that there was not enough focus on white people and whiteness in the curriculum. We've seen in more recent years, Arizona outlaw ethnic studies to remove from the curriculum education about people who are not white. This has been going on for some time. So for Mr. Trump now to come and say, we can't have people learning about themselves in public schools. When Arizona did that, they said, oh, it'll produce race riots. It'll make the children very angry. I totally reject that. When you teach people about themselves in public schools, people will want to be in public schools. People will be grateful for public schools that teach them something about themselves. In California, as well as in states across the country, students are saying right now, we want to learn about ourselves. We want to learn about our ethnic groups. This is the ethnic studies movement that is sweeping the country. The legislature in California, as well as the Senate, the university, Cal State University system, has said we will have ethnic studies in schools. This is not going to hurt the country. This is going to help students get the message that the school system itself cares about them. Trina obviously wants to say something, and I want to recommend the book after she says whatever she wants to say.
No, I was just going to add that this sort of whitewashed history is dehumanizing. I mean, the stories of all the different people in this country need to be told in an honest way. I mean, this type of history downplays the enslavement of Black people and the commoditization of Black bodies. I mean, this country was built on the unpaid labor of Black people. And that story needs to be told loud and clear. And by trying to create this sort of alternate history, it's just a way of trying to perpetuate systemic racism. Because unless you understand the history of the various groups of people in this country, you won't understand some of the things that are going on today. I mean, even though Black people essentially built this country, we still, because of systemic racism, we're still suffering in terms of wealth, we're suffering in terms of health, we're disproportionately negatively impacted by the criminal justice system. And so this type of effort is to just cover that up. We don't want to talk about it, we want to hear about it, we don't want to know about it, we don't care about it. And this is true not just for Black people, that's true for the indigenous people, Native Americans of this country. I mean, Europeans came here, stole, took their land, pushed them into reservations, and indigenous people have been suffering ever since, continue to suffer, with poverty and other medical issues. I remember when I was elementary school, growing up, we got the Christopher Columbus was a great guy kind of lessons, he discovered America kind of lessons. And then, at some point I got a little older and I learned, first of all, you can't discover something where people are already living there. but he was not this great guy. I mean,
he was not.
He killed people, kidnapped people, brutalized people, did all kinds of terrible things. But there's still this, in this country, we got statues to him, we got a holiday, we still are not recognizing the true story. And that's not right. I mean, you can't address the issues of this country. You can't move the country forward in a positive way for everybody unless you face the truth of the history.
And the truth is, there is systemic racism in every institution of our country. Every institution. We see it in housing, we see it in healthcare, we see it in education, we see it in business, we see it in the criminal justice system, we see it in the church. You cannot turn to any institution of our country and not see systemic racism. And this present administration that wants to, as Trina said, whitewash this, that approach appeals to people who have not experienced that. Joel Spring wrote a fantastic book called Deculturalization and the Struggle for Equality. And in that book, he profiles ethnic groups of color that have been the targets of deculturalization by white people from the very first time Europeans stepped foot on this soil, beginning with the Native Americans, denying people the right to be, putting them in boarding schools, thousands of people trying to run away from those boarding schools, but that was the policy of the country, denying Black people the right to be educated. There are other ethnic groups as well in that book, Deculturalization and the Struggle for Equality by Joel Spring. You know, another part of this pro-American curriculum is an attempt to outlaw critical race theory. Mr. Trump has attacked critical race theory. Critical race theory was embraced and taught by at least 20 different law schools in this country by 2002. Critical race theory says that race and racism has been a part of the United States since its founding. It has 5 tenets: a focus on storytelling, and that is everybody's story, not just the story of white people. A critique of liberalism, an understanding of whiteness as property. You know, we focus on, in this country and have for many years, on property rights. White people understand whiteness as property, and property comes with certain privileges. And we see white people with those privileges very, very clearly. What else? What did I say? Oh yes. Another tenet is interest conversion. We see in the country that white people will embrace policies that benefit them, and on their face, they may be beneficial to people of color as well. But when those interests converge, the interests of white people, the interests of Blacks and other people of color, then white people will embrace those policies, those procedures, those actions. And the fifth tenet is the permanence of racism. Derrick Bell, one of the prolific writers in critical race theory, wrote Faces from the Bottom of the Well. And the central theme of that book is that racism is a natural part of this country and it is permanent. It's not going anywhere. Now, the idea that critical race theory is somehow new and it's promoted by these liberal universities is trash. Critical race theory began as legal scholarship in the leading law schools of this country. You can read work by Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Derrick Bell, Patricia Harris. Critical race theory is an approach of transforming society so that society affirms and exists for all the people, not just some of the people. It means that we should be more aggressive in transforming the society instead of a more cautious approach to societal transformation, embracing such craziness as color blindness. Mr. Trump is way off base with downplaying critical race theory.
So let me just insert here, and then I want to move on to the last question of our conversation. One of the things that we have done and will continue to do is any of the resources that are mentioned in these conversations have been put in a sort of collective place. So when you see this, wherever you're watching this, if you look in the dialogue box underneath this video, you'll see the link that'll take you to the resources that were mentioned today and the resources that have been mentioned in all of the conversations. I think there's one thing that we agree on is that we need more education about race issues than less education, that the way to decrease systemic racism in America has everything to do with the education system and how young we can begin educating people about race issues. And we're trying to do our part in that and give our listeners some of those resources. So thank you for that. Thank you for more resources. I realize we could talk about this education point for a long time. Both of you are passionate about this education point. So I'm going to ask the last question, but Petrina, I get the sense that you want to say something, a final word about this piece of education. So let's do that, and then I'll go to the last question.
Mostly, I just wanted to put a resource out there. There's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. There's for the original version, and then there's one for young readers, which talks about some of the issues we're talking about in terms of correcting some of the history or giving the fuller story to history.
And I just want to make a correction. I mentioned Patricia Harris as associated with critical race theory, and I intended to say Angela Harris.
Okay. Thank you for that. One of the things I love about these conversations with you all is that you read so many books, and give us. I don't know where you have the time to read so much, but I admire that.
I'm 61 years old. I've been reading a long time.
So I appreciate all of these resources. So last question for today, So a couple weeks ago, right, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed from this life into the next, and God bless her soul. She was, of course, a power on the bench for a couple generations now when one considers issues of equality, whether that be gender equality or race equality or sexual orientation and all of that. And I guess, it certainly seems like the court is going to become more conservative. And again, we can't take that out of the political conversation, but my interest in this conversation here is, what impact does a more conservative court have on race relations? What negative impact does a more conservative court have on communities of color, given the kinds of things that we believe this court will be dealing with very shortly? Obamacare, Roe v. Wade, gun rights, voting rights, immigration issues. Wonder if we might just take a few moments and hear both of your perspectives about that.
Well, I'll just start by saying that the judges that presidents nominate for the court, especially in this case of this president, would reflect his views on things. I mean, he wouldn't put someone up there who doesn't reflect his views. So I'm concerned about a more conservative court in terms of voting rights, limiting voting, restricting voting, make it more difficult to vote. I'm concerned about a more conservative court impacting immigration rights. I'm concerned about, gun rights. So those are some of the things I definitely think will be impacted by a more conservative court.
If you pick up any one of those issues, immigration, gun laws, voting rights, any one of them will be disastrous. Mm-hmm. We saw a conservative court in a 5-4 decision gut pre-clearance a number of years ago in, was it Holder versus Shelby?
So in Shelby versus Holder.
Yeah, she's the lawyer. She'll get it right.
But
we saw
in more detail later.
Yeah, we saw pre-clearance gutted. States across the nation immediately began putting policies in place that would suppress the vote. It will be worse with a more conservative court. We see voter suppression right now, going on right now as people are voting. States across the nation will be even more severe in removing voting places, limiting the amount of time that people have to vote. It can only get worse, because what we've seen already is conservative judges, conservative administrations put policies in place that negatively affect Blacks and other people of color. They already have the track record. How can we expect anything less.
And the I guess Obamacare is supposed to come before the court and discuss about that one in a few weeks. And Trump and the Republicans have been trying for the last 10 years or so to get rid of it.
Well, they've gotten rid of pieces along the way. Now the plan is to remove it entirely.
And how I'm about to say.
Sorry.
I'm about to say this thing I'm about to say. I mean, how in the middle of a pandemic?
In the middle of a pandemic?
How do you take away people's health care? No other plan has been put forth that I've heard of. Have I missed something?
And they've had 10 years to do it. 10 years to do it. But they haven't done it. And who sees what we're talking about? People who will be negatively affected by it. Not the men and women of the Senate who will vote to eliminate the Affordable Care Act.
Well, they have insurance.
Their insurance is secure.
Obviously, in a pandemic, a lot of people lost their jobs. Healthcare, in a large part, is tied to your employment. That's part of the reason Obamacare is a good thing, because it decouples that to some extent. So now that all these people have lost their jobs in the middle of a pandemic with no alternate plan, and certainly people of color and Black people have been extremely, extremely negatively impacted by the pandemic in terms of getting sick, dying, losing jobs, just going into this pandemic with less wealth to help them ride through this economic downturn. So that's just going to have an extremely devastating impact.
Last week, we heard the supposed good evangelical Christian vice president say that this administration has a plan for protecting people with pre-existing conditions. In 10 years, these people have not told us what that plan is, and this man wouldn't say what the plan was last week when he made this statement that he and the president have a plan for protecting people with pre-existing conditions. Tell us what it is. And why can't they? Because they don't have such a plan. Period.
Yeah. So Petrina, would you enlighten us, the non-legal minds in this conversation? Shelby versus Holder, why do you bring that up? What's significant about that?
So it's significant because when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, one of the things that it did was address different processes and systems that made it difficult for Black people to register to vote and to vote. There's different devices were used, like literacy tests, poll taxes, and all kinds of other things that were done to keep Black people from voting. And so when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, it basically said that before certain areas, before certain states or certain counties that had a history of discrimination with respect to voting rights, before they can make any real changes to their voting procedures, those changes had to be reviewed and approved by either the Justice Department or a federal court. And so that process was called pre-clearance. Before you can make these changes, you got to clear it with us. So in 2013, this case became before the Supreme Court, where Shelby County, and I believe, I forget what state that's in, challenged the law, and the court essentially gutted that pre-clearance requirement. So jurisdictions that historically had issues with discrimination no longer have to get their changes pre-cleared. And Justice Roberts wrote in that opinion that essentially he said things are different now. We don't need this anymore. You know, the world is different than it was back then. We're good. We don't need this anymore. And Justice Ruth Ginsburg wrote a scathing dissent, completely obliterating that notion, saying that part of the reason that things seem to be better is because of the law.
Because it's working.
Because the law is working. And she made some kind of analogy of, why would you get rid of your umbrella in a rainstorm?
Because you're not getting wet.
Okay, because you're not getting wet. Thank you. So before the ink literally had dried on their opinion, cities, counties, states were starting to change their laws, requiring more identification requirements, reducing early voting hours, reducing polling places, doing all kinds of things to make it harder for people to vote. And so now we've even seen today, we're continuing to struggle with those issues. There's a case out of Texas right now where they're trying to reduce the number of drop-off locations for ballots. There's a case, I think, out of North Carolina or Georgia, I can't believe what state it is right now, where there's litigation over whether or not you need a witness to sign a mail-in ballot. We have the president basically claiming that there's going to be all kinds of problems with mail-in ballots without any evidence to back that up, in an effort to, raise doubts about the legitimacy of the election and discourage people from voting. We have, Trump also asking his supporters to guard the polls or to monitor the polls, which I think will have the impact of either discouraging people from voting or possibly create some kind of violence, on the day of elections.
And so let me go back to just one of those and sort of walk through. You mentioned Texas and decreasing the number of drop boxes for mail-in ballots in each county, and let me just walk through that with folks. So Governor Abbott has said that each county can only have one drop box. And now some people could argue, okay, that's a racist policy. Some people could argue, no, there's no racism in that, but he's trying to protect the integrity of the election. No matter whether the genesis of that decision is racist or not, we have to understand how it affects people of color. So if you put one box in each county, think about if you live in the county that incorporates a city like Dallas or a city like Houston, how far might you have to travel in order to turn in that ballot? Now, the people who have cars and, that's great. But what about people who take public transportation, which by and large probably is people of less means, so lower economic class. And now you have to take public transportation all the way across the city, which might take 5 or 6 different modes, 5 or 6 different buses and hours to be able to drop off your ballot. And it's very clear to us that poverty disproportionately affects communities of color. So was it racist was the genesis of eliminating all of those drop boxes racist? I don't know. Does it negatively affect people of color? Absolutely. There's no way that it won't. Now, I did read in the newspaper this morning that there was a stay put on that.
Right.
And so maybe that doesn't happen. I just want folks to understand that as we talk about this, it's one thing to say that this is a racist policy or that the genesis is racist, and there's a lot of fight against that. But that's not all that we're talking about. We're also talking about policies that their genesis may not be racist in nature, but that doesn't mean they don't have a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color.
That's right. When you look at laws, you look at different approaches, but disparate impact is an important concept to remember. Like you said, it may not be on its face racist, but if the impact on a law if the impact of a law is that it disproportionately hurts communities of color, then that's something that needs to be addressed. And that was partly what pre-clearance would do.
Right, right.
You know, different states and counties are trying, some are at least trying to make it easier for people, particularly in a pandemic, to vote. So they're promoting using ballots, they're promoting having people drop them off at different locations so they don't have to stand in line at polling places to do these things. You know, the Black community has been severely impacted by the coronavirus. So we don't want people having to take a bus to drop off their ballot somewhere, to have to stand in line for hours potentially to either vote or even to drop off, you know, having to even drop off a ballot. And it is, I think, under Trump's and possibly Republican analysis, the more people to vote, the less likely it, you know, the more it will hurt them. But you know, but the bottom line is, in a pandemic, we should be promoting ways to make it easier for people to vote. And in a country that is a democracy where voting is an important part of our creed and our history, we should be helping people to vote. But there just seems to be a move now to just do anything and everything to make it more difficult for people to vote.
Right, right, yes. Well, I want to give each of you a last word. We said we're going to be 45 minutes. We're over the 45-minute mark. Surprise, surprise for the three of us to be engaged in a long conversation. It's a conversation that, of course, could go on forever. We've talked about the church's part in this. We've talked about political part in this. We've talked about the education in race relations. We've talked about healthcare, voting rights, so much that we've covered today. And just to wrap up the conversation, what is a final word from each of you that might be touching on one of the things today, just a word of encouragement or a word of information that you might share with us as we close our conversation today? Dr. Branch, let's go you first.
I would just say that a lot of the news is bad news, but we should maintain hopefulness. We as a country and as a people have survived real bad times in the past, and we will get through these bad times as well. We are people of faith, and we continue to pray knowing that none of this takes God by surprise.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you.
I guess I just wanted to just go back to the, I guess we'll say the policy to eliminate disparity training or diversity training within the federal government. You know, it's important to have that type of training, and I don't know how pervasive it is or was, but the federal government issues a lot of contracts. They're a large employer, and so it's important that the federal government take the lead on promoting opportunity for its citizens. The federal government should be a model of promoting opportunity, fairness, and work to address systemic racist issues. I mean,
and helping those decision makers to see what it is, what it looks like.
And so it is very disturbing that those trainings are going to be eliminated because, like I said, the federal government should be a model a model of how to be a good employer, a model of diversity, a model of how to, work to serve all the people of this country.
That's right.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for the time that you've spent here, the time that you've spent in previous conversations. I know we have some future conversations planned, and we so appreciate your time. For those of you who are watching this, I would so hope that as people of faith, that this is not the one place you have where you engage in this conversation this week. Read the resources. Have these conversations with your children. Gather a group of folks and have these conversations. I mean, don't we want together as people of faith to work for not just a nation, but a world, to work for a world that works for everyone? And is that not the proclamation that Jesus was making in the gospel, the witness of the gospel? So we continue in this important work of faith together, and we thank you for joining us today. God bless. Good to see you all. Thanks for being with us again.
Thank you.